Hey everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of chapter 9, where we're going to be talking about making the rules between suppliers and customers. This is part 2 of the 7-part series for the chapter 9 videos for Shell. And I'm coming to you here from my workbench in my garage. This is where I come out usually at the end of the day after I've finished all of my stuff for the day, and just work on my models, which I haven't been able to do in a long time. My son and I got really into this a number of years ago, and then I just haven't had time to do it, so I've been using the time here at home to work on them a little bit. And I'm doing a couple of things. There goes the mail truck. I opened the door so we get some light. But anyway, so what I'm doing, a couple things. First of all, we fly these models, these are actually made of foam. And I don't know if you can see back here, I've got a whole bunch of them. We have about 15 of them or so, and they're very light RC. These are fully operational flying RC models. They're electric powered, use small electric batteries. And my son and I usually go over to the park or the school soccer field and fly these. But you know, of course, he's in Hungary, so I haven't been flying them myself, plus all the school facilities are closed. So the other thing I'm doing is building what are called stick and tissue models, and this is kind of an old art that has kind of died off since now everything is miniaturized. It's so easy to buy these things. You can buy one of these with the controller for usually sometimes less than $100. So if you fly them into a tree, just go buy another one. But I build these stick and tissue models, and I think it's probably kind of hard to see from where you are, so I'll hold it up. And you can kind of see it's made of stick. I've painted it green, but it's made of balsa stick like this, and you build it on a plan that looks like this. And so you lay out this plan on the workbench, put all the sticks on, you build the stick, put the sticks over the plans and build the parts, and then assemble the plane, and then when it's done, it looks like this. And so this is a rubber band powered stick and tissue plane that has some cover on it, some tissue. You cover it with actually tissue paper. And I build them either as gliders or as rubber band powered airplanes. So that's what I do here in my garage in the afternoon after I'm done with my work. Okay, so to our topic, we're talking about customers and suppliers now, and how how the market for is defined sometimes by by customers and suppliers. And so of course, cooperation with these kinds of parties is always best. It's always best to cooperate both with your customers and suppliers. We've been learning this in some of the negotiations that we've been doing, trying to find these win-win outcomes where everybody can come out ahead, ideally. But ultimately, these negotiations are about who gets how much, for the most part. Certainly in distributive negotiations, as we've learned, but all contract negotiations, at the end of the day, are a determination setting the amount of money that everybody's going to make. So if a vendor sets a higher price, then they're going to get more of the ultimate value that is produced by the downstream customers. So even though we like to cooperate, and I'm going to talk about this later in section 5, even though we like to cooperate, really this is a competitive situation. So who is going to capture the largest share of the value chain? So obviously suppliers, those are companies from whom you buy your inputs. So if I were manufacturing my airplanes, my suppliers would be the producers of the balsa wood. And if I could sell this airplane for a given price, and it's made up of a certain amount of balsa, then at the end of the day, that end purchase price of the final airplane is the maximum amount of value that's created, and the suppliers along the way are arguing or negotiating for a higher piece of that. So suppliers always want to receive more. They always want higher prices. They always want to provide as little as possible for what they get paid, and they want fewer quality requirements. Quality requirements are a big part of it, because sometimes a supplier produces, they deliver at a given price, but it doesn't meet the quality standards. So it's a balance. It's not always about price. It's about what's being delivered. Sometimes even when it's being delivered has a lot to do with its value. Meanwhile, customers, on the other hand, of course, they want the lowest possible price. They want as much value as they can get, and they want the most promises of quality and warranties and all of that. So the manufacturer in the middle of that, who's negotiating with vendors on the one side and customers on the other, is trying to find a way to collect or capture as much of that value. And of course, it's not always just three parties. As we'll look here, this is a picture of a Boeing aircraft, and it just shows how many different vendors are involved. The ultimate customer is the airline, who obviously wants to pay as little as possible for the airplane. And for those of you who don't follow this industry, airlines generally there's a list price for an airplane that almost nobody ever pays. Most airlines pay far, far less than the list price, and depending on the supply and demand situation, argue for lower and lower prices. I was just reading in the paper this morning having to do with coronavirus. They think that the demand for new aircraft will fall possibly in half in the coming years. So both Boeing and Airbus are cutting their production in half. It's going to be harder and harder for them to convince a customer to buy from them. And so they're going to be earning less on the customer side, and in all likelihood will be trying to squeeze their vendors to help them come up with some of that cost difference and still preserve some profit. But in a large, complex production like a Boeing aircraft, Boeing is dealing with hundreds, maybe even thousands of vendors. You're usually dealing with only a small handful of customers, but many, many vendors. Okay, so we're going to look at the pharmaceutical industry as an example. This was from the Shell book. And this is a great story, because not only does it kind of tie a lot of things together that we've already been talking about, but it's got a little bit of a historical context to it too. Remember that usually the customer and vendor relationships are governed by contracts, but don't forget the lobbying and regulation aspect of it also. That plays an important role. The contract is the private agreement between the two parties, but the market is often determined by the government. Shell makes the point, and I agree with this, that every business is regulated. We've talked earlier in this series about what it means to be a regulated industry, but the fact is that every industry deals with some level of regulation. Every industry's market is in some way defined by regulation. Another big lesson here, antitrust laws, they can be waived by Congress. And there are many examples throughout history of where Congress has waived antitrust laws for certain businesses. The NFL is one great example of that. So they have a special exemption. Drug branding, what is drug branding and why is it so valuable? When you see a drug ad, I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but there's always the drug brand, and then underneath it tells the drug's actual name. So it has, every drug has a name, and then it sometimes, in some cases, has a brand name. So ibuprofen, the brand name is Advil. That's one example. And we're going to look here in a minute at why this is such a big business. Drug patents, as we'll learn from this story, are a relatively new phenomenon. They have not always been the model has not always been this: invest in R&D, get a patent, and extract as many profits as you can from it during the exclusive period. But that's what the market has kind of turned into. And like I said, branded drugs are an enormous business. In the book, Shell mentions Lipitor as being a $7 billion a year business. But as you can see from this slide, $7 billion, that's not a big deal anymore in 2017 and 18. The top drug here is $18 billion. And look at how many of these are 7 and above, or even close to 7. So this is an enormous business. And if you can capture those profits by monopolizing a particular market for a particular drug, using a government monopoly for a period of time, that's going to be very, very valuable. One of the key points of the pharmaceutical story for me that I wanted to point out to you was the idea of business cycles or regulatory cycles. We all know what a business cycle is, and we're going through one of these right now. Sometimes the market goes up, it goes down, it goes up, and it goes down, and that's just the normal ebb and flow of the economy. But there's also regulatory cycles. So if you think about it, prior to the 1930s, there was almost no regulation of pharmaceuticals. I find that difficult to believe that it took that long, but apparently that's when it happened. It wasn't until the late 1930s that the FDA came into existence and there was some drug regulation. And as a result of that, it changed the dynamic of that business. It switched from the pharmacist being the kind of key player in that industry to the physicians, the coalition between the physicians and the pharmaceutical companies, because prescriptions are now required, FDA approval is now required, and this value that the pharmacists were bringing isn't there anymore. So that affected the relative leverage. It affected the shape of those industries, and then of course the contractual relationships between the parties. And as drugs became more expensive, and as HMOs, and if you're not familiar with what an HMO is, it's a health maintenance organization. They were very popular in the 80s, and the idea was that they would cut costs. They would get a lot of people, they would agree to treat these people, and they would use this massive buying power that they had to push prices down. And they had some success in doing that and in making generic drugs more available like we know they are today. But here's the point. And the point is that the cycle of this regulatory leverage determined where the profits were. It determined where the profits flowed. There are always profits in these businesses, probably more now than ever, but who gets how much? Well, that's not always determined by contract between the vendor and the manufacturer on the one side and the manufacturer and the customer on the other. That is part of it, but the regulatory structure tells you where the money is going to be, who has the leverage, and that then affects the contractual relationships between the parties. So that's all I have in this video. What questions do you have about customers and suppliers and defining markets? Maybe about the pharmaceutical industry, about the airline industry, about stick and tissue models. I forgot to show you, actually, here's one that's covered. So I'm about to, it's covered in tissue but hasn't been treated yet. So there's a treatment that you put on it that turns this tissue into almost a plastic. So I'll be doing that tonight. So anyway, thank you for watching here from my workbench in the garage, and we'll see you in the next video.